it's been nearly 6 years since I did my first tube video. Hard to imagine, hard to believe. And I've done something like more than 300 videos. And I must say, today I believe is the most unusual video I have ever done. I have maintained the discipline of having all the videos directly or indirectly about Angelina Jordan. And today it's more indirect than not. And we're focusing on the theme of her last 3 albums, where she has collaborated with her granny, Mary Zamani, who has tended to write the majority of the lyrics, if not the actual poetry, which has been put to music to make these 3 albums. And that's where we're going with today's video, because we're looking at song lyrics and poetry and how they're similar and how they're different. And it's a very complex subject. And to help us understand, we're going to someone who knows a lot more about these things than I do. We're going to an old family friend who happens to be a poet. Now, this is not something without precedent, because Angelina Jordan virtually did the same thing many years ago. Do you remember?
Angelina discusses her book Between Two Hearts with a family friend who's also a poet.
And we're going to meet a poet who has been exposed to many languages and many cultures. This is Liz Cashdan. So Liz, thank you for speaking with me, and thank you for allowing me to record this, and we will have a very interesting conversation.
Well, I hope so, yeah.
And the main subject that we will be speaking about, which is a very complicated subject, is song lyrics versus poetry. And you are in a very unique place to be able to speak about that. Now, before we get to that, give us some background about yourself and your life.
Okay, but I'm going to take the initiative here and make one comment on what you just said before I say anything about myself, and that is to comment on the word versus, because I think that immediately implies some kind of competition between song lyrics and poetry, and there shouldn't be a competition. They should go along hand in hand.
Okay, so tell us a bit about yourself and your life and your background.
Okay, so I was born in 1928.
So you are now 97.
In Hampstead, into a large house and a large family, and my parents were refugees from the Russian Revolution of 1917, and they arrived via Finland in the UK in 1920, and they had 4 children at that point. And then in 1920, when they came to the UK, 2 more of us were born, and I was the last one in 1928.
And most children growing up will have a mother and father and maybe a grandparent or 2 in their orbit. But you had a lot more than that, didn't you?
Well, I had a mother and father, a governess, and 5 older siblings. And I also had an occasional visiting grandmother who was living in Paris.
And you have visited many different places, and you have absorbed many different cultures from many different directions.
Yes, I was brought up in a house where different languages were spoken. So Russian was a background language all my childhood, and I was taught French and Hebrew at an early age, so they became important languages which I had a handle on, luckily, so that opened up new worlds to me as well.
And when and how did you evolve to become a poet?
Well, that was much later, because the whole family was evacuated because of the Second World War, and we moved to High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire. My father was still trying to do a curtailed business in the wool business in wartime UK with a contraband system that meant he occasionally got some wool in hand when the British Navy managed to make some snips off what the German Navy were doing. Now, poetry, yes. So I wasn't really into poetry, except I grew up hearing nursery rhymes in English, French, Hebrew, German and Russian. So I was very used to the sound of poetry and music going together. And I then did English literature at school, did a degree in history, and then I went into teaching. And it wasn't until I went into teaching that I became a writer myself, because I went to a conference of teachers of English. The guy who was leading the group I was in said, "All right, you English teachers, what have you been writing?" And we all looked sheepishly at one another and said, "Writing? We've been writing reports." And he said, "Well, that's not good enough. How can you teach kids to write if you don't write? You're going to start now." And I've never looked back.
Okay. What inspires you when you write a poem? How do you begin to formulate? What is the process?
It's different for every poem. I don't have a single process. But I guess a lot of what I write about comes out of family jokes, family stories, family histories, incidents, and then what's going on in the world around me. I was brought up on all these folk songs and nursery rhymes from across the world, and so they inspired the way I looked at words.
But many poets would answer that question by saying that they write poetry according to what moves them.
Well, move is an odd word. One of the things you want to do if you write is to have somebody read what you've written. I know there are people who say, "Well, I don't care about whether I'm published or heard. I do want to be heard." So I might look at the market as well as doing what moves me. So there are outside influences as well.
Now, you have some very clearly defined views of song lyrics, not verses, but the blend between poetry and song lyrics. Are they strange bedfellows, or are they compatible bedfellows?
I don't think they're bedfellows. I think they sleep in separate beds. I've never thought of that
Okay.
way of putting it, but it's a nice one. I like it. They are very definitely in separate beds, and they should remain in separate beds.
Okay. So are they different species?
Possibly, yes, though they have similar roots, because music and poetry started together. If you go back to ancient Greece, or if you go to stories around prehistoric fires and villages, then the storytelling based on some of the Greek stuff and then later of Anglo-Saxon stuff would have been musical background or words set to music and folk tales and folk songs. So they have been bedfellows in the sense that they grew up together side by side. So maybe siblings implies a husband and wife or lovers.
Okay.
I don't think they're lovers. I think they're siblings.
Okay. So the question is, can they interbreed, or would it be incest?
I think it would be incest, and it would probably result in all the things that incest is supposed to produce. In other words, an increased likelihood of disease and deformity.
Okay. And
I've not thought of that one before, but it's absolutely wonderful that you've come up with a metaphor of bedfellows, incest, deformity. I like it.
okay. And you find that most lyrics for most songs are extremely non-poetic. Is that true?
No, I wouldn't say that most lyrics are non-poetic. They might be poor poetry or failing poetry, but they're not non-poetic because they have rhythm.
Yeah.
They are usually, but they're expressing human interests within language, and that's what poetry does, and that's what songs do. So they're equally valid. I think it's a completely false attempt to compare them. It's like saying, should I play this piece of music on a violin or a cello?
Yeah.
Or should I play it on a flute or a violin? You could play it on both, but which one do you want?
Now, previously when we were talking, you gave many different examples of the marriage between lyrics and music, and you mentioned music by Schubert and lyrics by Muller, which is something totally off my radar. I had never heard of that.
Yes. So that was another thing I was brought up on. So very early on, I heard Schubert songs where he set Wilhelm Müller's poems to music. And I suppose because I had a knowledge of German, I knew what the songs were about. There's a lot been written about, if you translate those songs into English, what have you lost? So the translation aspect begins another whole thing, and I think that where you can translate from language to language, if you transpose from song lyric to poetry, or turn poetry into a song lyric, you might improve the poetry, you might ruin the poetry. I think what Schubert did was to make Müller's poems even better poems than they were.
So he augmented them. Yeah. Like in Genesis, he breathed into a lump of clay to make it human.
Well, I think probably Wilhelm Müller's poems are better than a lump of clay. They've already been breathed into. But he's taken the German language and breathed into it and made those poems. And although they may be a bit cliched, the music is not cliched.
Okay. And then, of course, you have Gilbert and Sullivan.
I am the very model of a modern nature general. I've information, vegetable, animal, and mineral. I know the kings of England and I quote the fights historical from Marathon to Waterloo in order categorical.
Well, then we come on to opera. Once you get to opera, you're in another world again, because here's a genre where you do an enactment, a play, on stage for an audience, and they listen and they watch. So do they listen with their eyes and watch with their ears? What are they doing? What's going on? Personally, I find opera quite difficult to take on board because my ears and eyes don't like working together too much. So whereas I can listen to the Schubert songs, I don't need to use my eyes. Of course, you've got it on the stage and you're supposed to use your eyes and your ears. So your sense of hearing and your sense of seeing and your appreciation of language and the storyline is all very important. And I suppose that goes back to some attempt, in some ways, to folk songs which tell a story like opera tells a story. And I guess a lot of pop songs and romantic songs are based on folk songs and like to tell a story as to they're just a unit within themselves. With an opera, you've got 3 hours worth of it. And by God, the music had better be good because the stories are usually pretty awful.
Okay. And you have a huge gap of understanding of contemporary music. Is it true that the most recent song you're aware of is Bob Dylan's Blowing in the Wind?
There are lots of songs since then because I've got children and grandchildren who've been playing them over and over. So while I may have turned away and not made a point of listening and knowing, I have been an unwilling hearer. Or shall I say, I've been a hearer rather than a listener. So I know some of these songs, although I don't like them particularly.
So your ears are greatly offended?
No, not my ears. My sense of language and, no, not even the sense of language. I think it's the music because I'm so into classical music that pop music just leaves me cold.
Yeah, fair enough. You have said that you feel that good poetry should sing without music.
Well, that's again a metaphor. It doesn't sing, it doesn't have music. The language, of course, has its own music. In the language, it has sounds that are pleasant or unpleasant. So if we think of Robert Burns' Field Mouse, then we've got a wee slick timorous cowering beastie. So those words have their own sounds, which lead us inevitably to the cowering field mouse. And it doesn't need music. Now, whether it's been set to music or not, I don't know.
Okay. Well, there's a Robbie Burns poem that was sung by Angelina Jordan. Shall we listen to that now?
Yeah. So this is not a pop song because this is a setting of a poem to music.
Yeah.
And that's different. So this is like the Schubert and the Muller.
But it was sung 10 years ago.
So the Schubert was sung 150 years ago.
It was upon a Lammas night when Coleridge's are lovely. Beneath the moon's unclouded light, I held away to Arnie. The time flew by with careless heat, till between the dark and dawn, with small persuasion she agreed to see me through the barley, to see me through the barley. The sky was blue, the wind was still, the moon was shining clearly. I sat her down with right good will among the ridges of barley, among the ridges of barley. I knew her heart was all my own. I loved her most sincerely. I kissed her over and over again among the ridges of barley, among the ridges of barley. But by the moon and stars so bright that shone that I was so clearly, I shall bless that happy night among the ridges of barley, among the ridges of barley. I have been left with comrades dear, I have been merry drinking, I have been joyful gathering money, I have been happy thinking, but of the pleasures ever I saw, for 3 times double fairly, that happy night was worth them all among the ridges of barley, among the ridges of barley.
So, nice poem by Robbie Burns, set to music by did Angelina Jordan write the music?
No, actually somebody wrote the music for her and then she sang it. So
why has she got this baby voice?
She's 10 years old when she's singing.
I think the tune is quite nice, but it's the baby voice, which I thought was being put on by an adult, but if it's not, if it's her
no, that's her. She's around 10 years old when she sings this.
Oh, right, okay. Good for her. What has she become? What's her adult voice like?
I consider that she has gone from strength to strength.
I think that would be nice round the family home at Christmas, or have the 10-year-old child sing that. It was an article by Simon Armitage saying that we should keep the two genres apart and not say is one the same as the other, or subject to the other, or similar to the other. So this was a Guardian article in 2008, and he said, songwriters are not poets, or songs are not poems, I should say. In fact, songs are often bad poems. This isn't true of Robbie Burns, because we're starting with a poem written 200 years ago, and then we're putting music to it. So it's a different genre. It's not a song lyric as good as or the same genre as a poem, because it starts as a poem. So I don't think this applies to Robbie Burns, Angelina Jordan situation. But he says that often songwriters write bad poems because they're musicians first, and so they're not really into making the best of words. So he says it's full of lumpy syllables, cheaty rhymes, exhausted cliches and mixed metaphors. So this doesn't apply to that song of hers or to using Robbie Burns.
Do you think it matters whether you have the music first and then you add the lyrics, or you have the lyrics first and then add the music? Do you think it matters at all?
I can't say because I'm not a songwriter, so I don't know. But I think we're talking about two different genres here. One is songs with their own lyrics and their own music, and the other is setting a poem to music. And you can set it well and you can set it badly. You can set it contemporarily or you can set it 200 years later and you'll get different.
Do you think music can improve a bad poem?
It can't improve the poem, it can improve the get-together. And you can say, never mind the words, I'm listening to the music, it's divine. And after all, I listen to oratorio, and I don't believe a word of the rubbishy text of the oratorios, but the music is divine. So you can have crazy words or bad words, and the music will bring them alive. And you could presumably have a beautiful poem and ruin it.
Can you give me an example of an oratorio?
Yes, I can tell you about the Mozart Requiem. So I've sung the Mozart Requiem and I've now written a poem about the Mozart Requiem. The words, of course, are taken from the Latin mass of the Requiem and are meaningless to me. And yet they're not meaningless because we're talking about and praying for the safety, for the health, for the dead person. My nephew died 2 weeks ago. I then looked at the score of the Mozart Lacrimosa and tears came to my eyes.
Yeah, okay. Last week when I was speaking with you, you mentioned Puccini.
Yes, that's grand opera, and I find that more difficult to take on board because often the drama and reality of the situation is held up by the music. So Madame Butterfly, where the lieutenant stands on the wall and he's about to throw himself over, and he says, I'm going to throw myself over, I'm going to throw myself over, and he doesn't, so he just stands there singing. So opera often produces ludicrous situations.
Okay, okay. Liz, it's been quite a kaleidoscope of an experience talking to you.
Right, yes. What happens to a kaleidoscope? Does it ever settle down, or does it go on colliding?
Our conversations are ongoing, if that's a parallel answer to your question. But today is not just a conversation about song lyrics and poetry, and today is not just about a celebration of your fascinating life. Today is actually a demonstration to young people that if they stop and take the time, they can learn very interesting things from people of advanced years.
Yes, they can. Well, I've got my 19-year-old granddaughter living in the same house with me, so we are able to have discussions about music and poetry, which is interesting. And she's into writing poetry, but she very much sees her poetry, I think, in a rhyme, so that it is definitely influenced by the pop world. Here's a poem I wrote quite recently called Pharmakon, which is the Greek word for medicine, which can either cure you or kill you. So you can get your paracetamol at the pharmacy, but you can also get your arsenic at the pharmacy. So I've taken these Greek words because, in a sense, poetry goes back to the world of Greece as well. And I make a joke about diglossia, anaphora, and epithalamion, which are Greek words for different aspects of poetry writing. I'm also getting at a guy who runs something called a poetry pharmacy, in which he prescribes various ways to write better poetry, with the hope too of making you feel better. I do think that writing poetry does make you feel better, but it isn't my purpose. I don't write to feel better. That's a spin-off.
Are you a storyteller?
I tell stories, yes. I like telling stories in poems and in prose. But again, I like storytelling as an activity of fun, like nursery rhymes. So here's my answer to the people who want to prescribe cures for poetry that's not working. Pharmacon. The last thing I want is a poetry pharmacy. I'm fed up with all the pills I have to swallow to keep my ticking heart, to stop the wallow of my walk. So let the words of poetry stand alone. No doctoring, no scan, unless the lines might need another beat. Some paracetamol for dragging feet. My poems will get better without a plan. Please stop prescribing all those horrid pills. Dig Lossia and Abhorra, Epit Halemion, as if the very sound of it might bring more health to my poeticals. 14 lines of sonnet is what I treasure, with pentameters, iambic for good measure.
Thank you, Liz.
Now you'll notice that this is a rhyming sonnet, and it is written in iambic pentameters, so it has a regular musical beat. So it's perhaps the nearest thing I come to writing song. Sonnet means little song.
Of course.
So it's a good one to end up with a discussion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great. Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much.
Thank you.